Good evening, everyone. I want to start with taking you back to 80 years ago today. 80 years ago today was a windy day in Utrecht. There was a drizzle, which interrupted brief moments of sunshine. It was cold. The day was the 4th of May, 1944, and the local newspaper, the Utrechtse Courant, reported the news from home and abroad. This was a newspaper printed in times of occupation and war, and one has to be careful when looking at its contents. But still, the front page is telling. The headlines run stories of heavy Allied bombings on Belgian cities, of shot-down British planes flying over the Netherlands, of Soviet forces which had just taken Yalta in Crimea and which were pushing ahead while German and Romanian forces tried to coordinate a counteroffensive, of Italy, where Nettuno near Rome, as well as Florence, had been bombed by the Germans and the Americans, respectively. While in Berlin, Joseph Goebbels, who by now had been the Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda for over a decade, he had just been promoted to Staatspräsident, a role similar to that of mayor in the city of which he had been the Gauleiter, the main Nazi representative, since 1926. The newspaper also reminded the readers to darken building windows and vehicles between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. And that of verduisteren, to darken, here, had been mandatory, and it making it harder for the pilots of the enemy forces to see where exactly they were flying over. And you can see in the video a few of the ways in which people were darkening their own buildings. The readers of this newspaper page had been living under occupation for about 4 years. They did not know that a massive amount of Allied forces was almost ready to land in Normandy, just a couple of weeks away, leading the way to the liberation of much of Western Europe. They did not know that tens of thousands of lives would be lost that winter in the Netherlands, 44 to 45, as a consequence of a food embargo which had been imposed by the German occupying authorities in what we now remember as the Hunger Winter. More broadly, they did not know that the war was going to end in just over a year. They may have hoped so, but they could not know for sure. Nor could they know that 8 decades later we would be here, gathering our thoughts for the dead, military and civilian, in times of conflict. Dear attendees, it is an honor for me to address you this evening. But the prospect is also daunting. Today marks a day of commemoration and remembrance of the victims of war, and it is important to mark this with the attention and the respect that it deserves. But with the violence of conflict spreading in Gaza, as well as in Ukraine, as well as over 50 other countries, just now as I speak, many are on edge. The measures taken to protect the ceremony of this evening at the Dam and elsewhere also illustrate the state of alertedness surrounding events regarding the memory of the victims of past conflicts and present ones. And these measures themselves speak, I believe, to the theme that I have chosen for this evening already many months ago, that of remembrance in times of crisis. So the aim of my talk this evening is reflective. I would like to take some time to raise some questions. And I might not have the answers to all the questions, but I hope that raising them will encourage some thinking, some reflection about the violent past and its enduring legacy in the present. Because memories are not just personal. They're also shared, they're collective, they are political. and how one deals with a difficult inherited history differs from place to place and changes over time. This evening, the focus of my talk will be especially on the aftermath of the Second World War, and also from a European perspective. Other conflicts and other perspectives also do matter, but this is my perspective. You will understand as I go on in the talk, both from a personal and from a professional perspective. And of course, I also think that this is a conflict which left behind a legacy with which many countries are still grappling today. Let me just start with some numbers. At least 250,000 Dutch people lost their lives in the Netherlands, Indonesia, and elsewhere during the Second World War as a result of direct acts of war or measures taken by the occupiers. These 250,000, this is a conservative estimate, but it is also an estimate that accounts for the victims of the persecution of the Jews, Roma and Sinti victims, civilian casualties of the war, those who perished given the decline in public health conditions, the victims of the hunger, those who died during forced labor in Germany, those who died in concentration camps in the Netherlands, those who died in German prisons and concentration camps abroad, the volunteers who had joined German service and were killed, those who perished while serving the Royal Dutch Navy, the Royal Dutch Army, Merchant Navy personnel, those who died in German captivity, those who died in Japanese captivity, interned civilians killed in Indonesia, and also men and women who were executed in the Netherlands, almost all of whom were members of the resistance. The total number of casualties for Europe ranges between 15 to 20 million lives lost. Around the world, estimates of those killed vary from 35 to 60 million. And the remnants of that conflict are still very much with us today. They are present in our physical world. These are to be found in museums, sometimes in our homes, but also in the natural environment, where ammunition remnants can still be found, for example, on beaches or in woods. This is also part of what a Princeton professor, historian Rob Nixon, calls slow violence. It is a violence which occurs gradually. It's not necessarily visible. It is still destruction. And in a sense, it also resonates with the photos that you've seen coming in this evening. But those events are also still present because we choose to commemorate them in occasions such as that of this evening. But when confronting the vastness of such a conflict as World War II, which played out in so many different countries, which affected so many different lives, there are some questions that are worth considering. First, what does it mean to say that memory, and especially memory of conflict and mass violence, can at all be considered collective? And also, what does it mean to remember and commemorate the dead in conflict today, in an age which experts have termed an age of crisis? The attempt to deal with these two questions will structure this talk this evening. But before I proceed, one point about definitions. In the specialized literature, remembrance, commemoration, memory, they have different specific meanings. But in this talk, I want to use them interchangeably because doing so allows me to reflect on a variety of modes in which humans, in this country and other, deal and have dealt with the aftermath of a traumatic past. How to mark the commemoration of the Second World War is a hugely contested topic in various different societies, in various different countries. So I want to start by giving you some concrete examples. I'm originally from Italy, a country which entered the war as a fascist dictatorship allied with Hitler. The Netherlands, instead, was attacked, it was invaded, it was occupied in record time. These are very important differences, but in both countries, there were perpetrators and victims. There were those who chose to collaborate, and there were those who chose to resist. And both countries are struggling today with questions about how to deal with memories of such a violent past. These questions erupt in particular in this period. As a historian and as a European based in both countries in some way, I look with interest at the discussions that take place between the 25th of April and the 4th and 5th of May, namely between the Italian Liberation Day and the Dutch Remembrance and Liberation Days of the 4th and the 5th of May. Because this is the period in which, year after year, difficult questions come up. In Italy, for example, among other controversies that have come up this year, one revolves around the fact that government representatives have avoided pronouncing the word anti-fascism when marking Liberation Day. Italy does not have a corresponding date to the 4th of May in the Netherlands. There is not a 24th of April. What I mean is that there is no division between a day for commemoration and remembrance and a day to celebrate liberation. To celebrate liberation, living in freedom, living in democracy. And so you can imagine how struck I was the very first time that I attended the Remembrance ceremony here in Utrecht. Back then, I had started working quite recently at the University of Utrecht, where I designed a new course for bachelor students, Institutions of Global Governance, Instituties van Wereldbestuur. And a Dutch colleague who was teaching in my course took me to the ceremony at the Dome Square here. Coming from different countries, with different histories, but united also in some ways, we stood in that square together, and together with many others. We stood in silence. According to Brown, silence during commemorative practices provides, and I quote, an opportunity for the collective to rediscover itself as such, to temporarily suspend disputes, and to become unified in common remembrance of loss. What Brown is writing is that silence can be a sort of common language, one that is marked by the absence of speech. And a language that also serves as a reminder that there is only so much that words can do. So that ceremony deeply impressed me, and I couldn't help but ask myself, who are all these people in this square thinking about? To whom are the thoughts of the people in this square going? The answer to these questions is, of course, private, and for each of us, it is different. But there is also a memorandum about who is remembered on the 4th of May. And I quote from the English translation. During the National Remembrance Day, we commemorate all civilians and military personnel who were killed or murdered in the Kingdom of the Netherlands or anywhere else in the world, both during the Second World War and the colonial war in Indonesia, as well as in war situations and peace operations afterwards. The text of this memorandum is not fixed. It has changed already various times in the course of its existence. And it is important, I think, to remember that even before the commemoration was formalized in a memorandum in 1946, the societal commemoration, bottom-up, of the dead had already begun, with silent marches held in the memory of former resistance members. Later changes, there were several, and they dealt not just with the form, but also with the content of the remembrance. I will just give you 2 examples, among many others that I could have picked. In 1961, those who died after 1945 during service in the military were included in the remembrance too. And the most recent changes, They were introduced in 2022 to include also all the Dutch and Indonesian victims of the war that unfolded in Indonesia between 1945 and 1949. So these three turning points, 1946, 1961, 2022, these changes, they were accompanied and followed by debate not just about the form, but specifically about the content of the remembrance, of the collective remembrance of the war. What form should that take? This evening, I will be speaking about various dimensions of memory: personal and collective, national and international, and also memory in the past, the present, perhaps even the future times. But in order to do so, there is one key question that I want to start from. How can something so personal and individual as memory, how can that at all be considered to be collective? The person that you're seeing in the slide, Maurice Halbwachs, is the first one who is a sociologist who became known for postulating the existence of such a thing as a collective memory. And postulating this existence of a collective memory, this seems like a contradiction in terms. What could be more personal than memory? In order to answer this question, we need to take a step back of about 100 years. Halbwachs was writing and thinking at the beginning of the 20th century. He was influenced by the context of his time, as I would argue that we all are. And in particular, it is important to recall the cultural, the scientific, the political context of the late 19th century and the turn into the 20th century. This was a period marked, among others, by strong pulls towards rationalization, modernization. To give you an example from my own discipline, history, this was the period in which pulls about gathering objective knowledge about the past became especially dominant. It was not only possible, but also very important to write history, wie es eigentlich gewesen, how it really was, in the words of Leopold von Ranke. But this pull towards objective knowledge and rationality, this was not just a development that unfolded in history. Think about many other domains of society. For example, demography, social planning, even commerce. The emphasis on the fact that reality could be measured, catalogued, known, this was important to all of these fields. These were important developments, but they were also accompanied by a healthy dose of skepticism. So much focus on rationality, on the measurability of things that could be known, also brought with it skepticism on the part of thinkers who dared to think otherwise. Halbwachs was fascinated in particular by figures such as French novelist Marcel Proust, philosopher Henri Bergson, and the founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, among many others. These were all very different figures. They worked on very different topics and in very different fields, but they were all fascinated by and became increasingly preoccupied with the workings of the mind and also the workings of memory. So at a time in which this emphasis on objective knowledge about the past was postulated, was put forth very loudly, they instead insisted on the fact that memories were crucial in order to understand not just the past, but meaningful connections to the past. In particular, Bergson proposed a radically new and different philosophy of the experience of time, placing memory at the center. Instead of understanding memory as a passive storage, something that we might be tempted to do now in the age of technologies and IT, but instead of understanding memories as a passive storage, Bergson instead characterized remembering as an active engagement. He did not think of memory as an objective reproduction of the past. Instead, he thought of memories as fluid and ever-changing. Some of these thoughts were very influential on Holbach's, and it was in this context that he postulated the existence of such a thing as collective memory. In his words, it is in society that people acquire their memories. Now, tracing the history of the concept of collective memory might seem like a philosophical exercise, but instead, the study of the existence of such a thing as collective memory intersects very closely with the history that we are marking and commemorating today. Halbach was living in turbulent times, and in 1944, shortly after having been given a chair in social psychology at the Collège de France, he was arrested by the Nazis, together with his sons, because of their activities in the resistance. Just a few months before the end of the war, he passed away in the little camp of the Buchenwald concentration camp system. And it was his daughter, Jeanne-Alexandre, who managed to have his unfinished manuscript on collective memory published in 1950. And this is a work that has become a standard reference on modern memory theory. So as you can see, the history of the concept is closely intertwined with the historical events that we are commemorating today. And the book came out in 1950. You can imagine that at that point, there were strong pulls to go beyond the Second World War. And trying to move beyond the Second World War was an important factor in the early stages of European integration. One of the key turning points in these early histories of European integration was the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community with a treaty that was signed in 1951 and which came into effect the following year. The original signatories included both the Netherlands, Italy, as well as France, West Germany, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And the treaty aimed at establishing a common market for coal and steel. What does any of this have to do with collective memory, you might ask? As a historian, I often find that diplomatic treaties and documents can tell us a lot, not just about history, but also about memory. And this document is quite interesting. The document that established the community read that by founding it, those countries resolved, and I quote, to substitute for historic rivalries a fusion of their essential interests, to establish, by creating an economic community, the foundations of a broad and independent community among peoples long divided by bloody conflicts, and to lay the basis of institutions capable of giving direction to their future common destiny. It is not a coincidence that the document which founded that community explicitly mentioned the bloody conflicts that had taken place between European countries in earlier years, presenting also the hope to forever leave behind a war in which so many had died. 50 years later, in the early 2000s, European policymakers, so at the European level, but a much enlarged and a much different Europe at that time, decided to start investing in a common vision of the European past. These efforts were part of initiatives such as the Europe for Citizens programs and many other ones, which invested in, and I quote, active European remembrance activities. As Markus Prutsch, the fellow of the Heidelberg Academy of Sciences, wrote, the European investment in memory-related activities in the early 2000s, a lot of these actions were motivated by the intention of constructing a pan-European historical narrative, one which could act as an identification point for many European citizens, all of them potentially. However, paradoxically, by pursuing these attempts of a common European memory, it also became very clear that different European countries had different priorities when it came to commemoration. It was a big challenge to propose a uniting and unitary vision of the European past. And those measures were accompanied by many fierce debates, including debates about the Second World War, its history and its legacy. But that discussion was not and is not just present at the international level. Domestic debates took place and they continue as well. For example, recent Polish and Hungarian memory laws, the Polish one partly repealed now, have mandated specific ways of remembering the past, criminalizing any suggestion of local collaboration with the Nazi authorities. These measures, I believe, show just how delicate and difficult the legacy of that past is today, and also how much attention policymakers devote to guarding the memories of what happened during the course of and in the aftermath of the Second World War. Grouping together all these very different cases is a much broader question, namely, how do societies commemorate lives lost in situations of conflict or widespread political violence? The answer to this question contains a deeply political choice, namely, a choice that is relevant for defining the group, the society as a political unit. And this is also entailing a choice or choices that can resonate with people or not. Because deciding who and what to commemorate also seems to imply a much more uncomfortable series of questions, such as whose grief is legitimate, about which past, about which victims. These questions become all the more pressing during an age of crisis, which is how experts have defined the term that we're living with and through right now. We are living in times of conflict, military, geopolitical, but also economic, social. We're possibly going towards climatic catastrophe. And this matters in order to understand contemporary tensions, but also contemporary sensibilities, including in situations of remembrance of past deaths, in past conflicts. So almost 80 years after those events, do we still have the possibility to avoid cliches, to still find new ways to engage with the past, to make it relevant for our days as well? This question is not new. Many decades ago, Holocaust survivor Primo Levi, in his collection of essays, The Drowned and the Saved, warned of this danger, which I would call the danger of the cliché, when he wrote, and I quote, "A memory evoked too often and expressed in the form of a story tends to become fixed in a stereotype, in a form tested by experience, crystallized, perfected, adorned, which installs itself in the place of raw memory and grows at its expense." So the question is it possible then to defy stereotypes, to defy fixed, immutable images about the past when we commemorate it, because these images tend to lose their relevance for younger generations? I think it is. Think, for example, about a recent movie, The Zone of Interest. This movie depicts the life, the family life of the Auschwitz commandant and his wife, proud of her home and her garden surrounded by a wall. Beyond that wall, the viewer sees all the time the smoke rising up, hears blood-chilling noises in the background, and is aware all the time that something horrendous and atrocious is happening on the other side of that fence. This, I believe, was a powerful way to tell a history that we know, or at least that we should know, in new and powerful ways, while also making a point that is timeless, a point about the deep-seated human temptation to look the other way when atrocities unfold. In the aftermath of the Second World War and the Holocaust, how to deal with perpetrators such as Höss was a crucial question. And 2 years ago, I interviewed the late Benjamin Ferencz. Among many other roles, he was the former chief prosecutor for the United States Army at the Einsatzgruppen trial in Nuremberg. He was just 25 at that time, and by the time I spoke to him from the, not so far from here, from the Utrecht University studios, by the time I spoke with him, he was 101 years old, just about to become 102. And I was very curious to know, how did he look back to his experience at and after Nuremberg? This is what he told me. I have come to the conclusion that it is not enough to punish a handful of criminals. You have to create a world that is more humane, more peaceful. As you can imagine, in preparation for this evening, my thoughts did not just go to the remembrance of war, but often to the acts of war themselves. Why do humans still fight, degrade each other? This is a question that transcends the Second World War. And before I conclude, I want to take a step back, all the way to ancient Greece, to the 7th century before the Common Era, and read out a passage from a classic war poem that narrates about aggression, arrogance, vengeance, rage. It is the Iliad, Homer's Iliad, an epic poem dominated by heroes, most prominently by Achilles. Achilles, a hero who is frequently depicted in popular culture in our days too. Now, there is one particular scene that I think is worth recalling on a day dedicated to the memory and the remembrance of those who died in conflict. It takes place, this scene, after Achilles killed Hector. Hector had killed in battle Achilles' love, Patroclus. And Achilles had not just killed Hector, but he also disfigured the corpse. The Iliad narrates of the father of Hector, the old Priam, the king of Troy, who decides to cross the battle lines to go to the enemy warrior Achilles to beg him to give him back the body of his son. So the old king crosses the battle lines, kneels down, kissing Achilles' hand, the ones that had murdered his son, speaking to Achilles, appealing to him, asking him to think also of his own father, so in a way appealing to his own humanity. Those words stirred within Achilles a deep desire to grieve, and overpowered by memory, both men gave way to grief. Priam wept freely for men killing Hector, his own son, throbbing, crouching before Achilles' feet as Achilles wept himself, and their sobbing rose and fell throughout the house. So what does it mean to see Achilles the hero crying in a war poem? This is not the depiction of the hero that we usually see in our public culture, but I think that it is a very significant one. In that moment, Achilles does not see the enemy, even though he has been fighting against the people of that king for a long time, even though they killed his love. Instead, Achilles sees an old and frail parent, now alone, having lost all sons in battle. And so the hero cries, for his own loss, for that of the father of the enemy kneeling in front of him. So what is it that makes us human? Is it a terrible love for war, as psychologist James Hillman wrote? Or is it instead the possibility to look into the eyes of the other, the enemy, and recognize instead ourselves, our own fragility and our own humanity? Even though so much in the world pushes us to think the former, I choose to believe that the latter is the case. So what does it mean to commemorate the dead in war today in an age of crisis? It means to know that past conflicts, mass violence, they do not just simply pass away. They never have, and they never will. Going back to the 4th of May, 1944, we will never know exactly who the readers of that first newspaper page were. What did they do that day? But also more broadly, what were their dreams? What choices did they make? What choices would we have made had we been in their shoes? The work of the historian involves dealing with the facts, as well as knowing that not all the questions that we have about the facts of the past can be answered. And yet, still to continue to believe in the importance of engaging with the multitude of facts and lived experiences that history is made of, because they made us who we are today, both as individuals and as societies. So remembering them is important, and remembering also conflicts and mass violence matters, because the act of remembering them is not just personal, it is also collective and political. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorena, for your talk. As I promised you, there is a third way that we're going to reflect tonight, and we're going to listen to some music, which is played by Christian Kuyvenhoven. He's a renowned pianist in the Netherlands and all around the world. His work aims to inspire audiences with classical music in a personal and creative way. In addition to his work as a pianist, Christian recently published a book called The Maestro with the Knitting Needle, in which he searches for the secret of great conductors. Please welcome to the stage Christian Kuyvenhoven. Zet je hem uit alsjeblieft.
Dankjewel. Goedenavond, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Christian Kuivenhoven. I'm a pianist and presenter. And tonight I do not want to talk too much. I didn't want to start talking after Dr. Lorena De Vita has spoken such wonderful, beautiful, inspiring words to think about. At least it gives me a lot of food for thought. Thank you for that. Instead of talking, I'm playing music. I just played a sonata by Domenico Scarlatti, Italian-born composer from the 17th century. He wrote about 555 of these sonatas. Every one of them is beautiful. And I thought this one would be especially applicable for today. Since it is so mournful, it's so sad, yet it is so powerful in its expression. And the expressive power of music always gives me comfort. I think that is one of the most unique qualities of music, that it is expressive, it's in the moment, it's in time, and therefore it recalls memories in time. It applies to different memories every time you hear the same piece of music. And therefore, I think it would fit your story very well, as I hope it did. Now, music has a lot of emotions, different emotions, and the next piece I'm playing is very hopeful, I would say. Perhaps you feel it differently, but to me it feels very hopeful. But it has a title which is called Pavane pour une infante défuntée, which means pavane, that's a Spanish dance, for a deceased princess. It's written by Maurice Ravel, French composer, and he actually chose the title because he liked the alliteration of it in France. Pavane pour une infante défuntée. So it doesn't have a literal meaning. Yet, of course, the title is very suitable for this day, for the impressive 2 minutes of silence we had tonight, and the atmosphere of the music. I hope you feel very comforting. Maurice Ravel.
We're not used to bowing, sorry. Thank you for leaving us on such a hopeful note tonight. Thank you, Lorena, for your beautiful words and your story. I think there's nothing left for me to say but to wish you a pleasant evening, and I hope to see you again at one of our events. And for now, I wish you a good evening. One last round of applause for our